what we need is to get back to these radical roots of the Communist Party.
The Voice to Parliament is the new agenda for Australia, and the support behind this big push is anything but grassroots. In recent weeks, Australia has come to realise that everything from the banks, trade unions, corporations, and even so-called independent news media, as well as mainstream media, supports and promotes the Voice to Parliament. In fact, according to the Financial Review, almost all of the ASX top 20 companies publicly advocate for an Indigenous voice to Parliament ahead of this year's referendum. Today I wanted to focus on what is actually behind the voice, and the truth might shock you. The extent to which this voice to Parliament poses a threat to the future of our nation cannot be understated. I ask that all of you out there are made aware of just how deep it truly goes, so be sure to share this video around. Since Australians have to vote on this, I think it's important that we realise just how dangerous this bill is. I first want to focus on some of the people behind the Voice to Parliament. Thomas Mayo is one of the biggest proponents of the Voice to Parliament. A quick glance at his profile will reveal that he is of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, who holds the position of National Indigenous Officer within the Maritime Union of Australia, an activist for Aboriginal causes, and a public voice for Indigenous constitutional recognition. Thomas Mayo has spoken publicly on many occasions and even written books about his master plan for Australia. He has outlined three main points in particular which are worthy of focus: voice, treaty, and truth. The slogan you can see being worn by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. So we know where he stands. So the first point, voice. This is in reference to the Voice to Parliament, and putting it into the Constitution. Some of you might be asking, if this is just an advisory board, why does it need to be put into the Australian Constitution? Well, that's because once it's put into the Constitution, it can't be voted out. It's there to stay forever, and it can only be made stronger over time. They are laying the groundwork for more control in the future, which they openly admit to.
It's going to be very difficult once we succeed for a government to ignore this voice. It will be powerful when the people of Australia mandate that this First Nations voice must exist beyond the political cycles, because that's the goal here, is to set up a mechanism that actually exists despite the government of the day, and that's mandated by the people. So it is going to be, this is why we've had the fight for years, because they know how powerful this will be, and that's why we're asking you to walk with us. We need the 97% to apply that political pressure.
The second point, treaty. What does this mean? Isn't this what the Communist Party and Antifa activists have written on all their posters at Black Lives Matter protests? Following the referendum, it's expected attention will shift towards the Maricata Commission to work on a national process of treaty making. In fact, mainstream media reports suggest the government might move even faster. Proponents of this treaty urge that it's about giving Aboriginal people self-determination. But upon closer inspection, what does that actually mean? It's actually about the 100-year-long, well-documented communist plan of giving sovereignty to Aboriginal people, giving them land and making them a separate entity to Australia. By doing this, they would basically be a law and a nation unto themselves, which will also allow them to bring anyone into the country that they choose, including enemies of Australia, militant revolutionists from overseas, who have openly been preparing for such an event to happen. It creates a very large national security risk, especially when the CPA openly admits it's been trying to arm Aboriginals, form militias and create violent revolutions for around 100 years. A treaty would work one of two ways: the balkanisation of Australia, where territories and states become fragmented, or giving the Aboriginal people right to be an apartheid-wielding dictatorship over the entire nation, where democracy means nothing. Both of these plans are extensively written about in books and websites authored by communist and socialist activists in Australia, who openly admit to spearheading this entire agenda. On top of this security risk, it also poses a question about land and resource acquisition. Thomas Mayo has claimed publicly that he wants Australia to pay reparations and rent for living on the land. Meaning, all of you working class people who pay rent and mortgages on your home will be forced to pay additional rent for the privilege of living on this land.
At voice architect Thomas Mayo for previously saying it will allow First Nations people to punish politicians for ignoring them.
You know, this is the first step. It's a vital step. Pay the rent, for example. You know, how do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
What we need is to get back to these radical roots of the Communist Party.
If you thought rental prices and inflation was bad now, you just wait. The third point that is outlined is truth, which is a reference to what they call truth-telling. They want propaganda programs and state-sanctioned brainwashing forced down the throats of Australian people about how evil white people are for being alive in this country. This weaponized indoctrination is aimed at education and media, but it also concerns the limit on freedom of speech. They want their own pseudo-history being told by Bruce Pascoe and people alike, and state-sponsored critical race theory being taught about so-called genocide of Aboriginal peoples. Yuri Bezmenov, a defector from the KGB, talks about this indoctrination process and how it's used by communists to overthrow nations.
According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages.
With all of this in mind, is it really all a coincidence that Thomas Mayo is openly pushing for what is very clearly a communist plan? No, not at all. He is a trained and fully pledged communist revolutionary. In an article written by Michael Smith, who did some fascinating research into the history of Thomas Mayo, he discovered certain information which comes of very little surprise. Thomas Mayo was the protege of Brian Manning, an MUA activist working on the Darwin waves when a young Thomas Mayo put his hand up to be an organiser for the Maritime Union of Australia, Northern Territory branch. Quote, Brian Manning was an out-and-out communist, joining the CPA in Darwin in 1959. The following year, he was elected delegate to attend the Congress of the Communist Party of Australia. An ASIO document in 1962 reported in great detail the so-called penetration of Aboriginal organisations by communists, and detailed that in Darwin, communists, George Gibbs and Brian Manning, had helped establish the Northern Territory Aboriginal Rights Council in 1962. The focus of the struggle again shifted to independent activity of the Indigenous people themselves. And again, the Communist Party of Australia, CPA, left-wing trade unionists and socialist left offered vital support. The NTCAR, in which communists George Gibbs and Brian Mannings were leading members, played a crucial role. Gibbs was secretary of the NAWU, Militant Waterside Workers Section, whose executive had a CPA majority. Manning was a wharfie and a secretary of the CPA branch. The Darwin Waterside Workers had maintained their strong support for Aboriginal people's rights that began in the 1920s. Unquote. We have also uncovered articles both from MUA and Search Foundation, a successor to the Communist Party of Australia, where Thomas Mayo describes himself as a militant communist who seeks to overthrow the government. He has always worked closely with extremists, and he still does to this very day, which we will soon show in more detail. It should also be noted that according to the Independent Education Union of Australia, Thomas Mayo is only partially Aboriginal. His father is Filipino and his mother is Polish and Jewish, according to their archives. But he will have you believe Australian folk who have been here for generations are living on stolen land and should pay him rent. When you look at all the main proponents behind the Voice to Parliament, you'll find every single aspect of it is communist, which I will demonstrate more later in this video. Let's look at Marcia Langton for an example, a fully pledged, trained communist. According to the Unshackled and One Voice Australia, who both reported on this, for many years, Marcia was a high-ranking member of the National Committee of the Communist League, a Trotskyite group that campaigned for the violent overthrow of Australia and the implementation of a totalitarian regime. An organisation with links to espionage and terrorism. And this woman is meant to be one of the biggest figures behind the Voice to Parliament and the one who gets most of the media attention. She has also enjoyed the company of many politicians over the years, as well as trade unions, not to mention her long-standing relationship with ultra-rich Jewish businessman Mark Liebler, who's been involved in Aboriginal committees for decades.
The hatred of Aboriginal people. Utterly horrible abuses of Aboriginal people and whole populations for more than 200 years. Concepts of race are fundamental to Australian polity and civic life. Racial theories and eugenicism were major intellectual exports of Australia. This filth is in our parliament. We need to stop the lying. Do not kill Aborigines. How hard is that? The racism towards Aboriginal people is something more than racism. The whole of Australia needs to be re-educated.
Mark Liebler himself is also another big proponent behind the Voice, with a very extensive history in lobbying political candidates and enjoying the ear of politicians for decades. His role in Aboriginal advocacy spans all the way back to the 1980s, and perhaps even earlier. In fact, almost everybody of relevance behind this Voice has got some history connecting them directly to the CPA. From Noel Pearson, for an example, who works on the committees of many Aboriginal groups which are openly spearheaded by communist revolutionaries. Lara Watson, the Indigenous officer at the ACTU trade union, which according to its history on Wikipedia was started by communists with direct links to former Soviet Russia. She's also been photographed attending and sometimes even guest speaking at many of the protests and events run by CPA affiliate organisations and activist groups. Even the Prime Minister himself, Anthony Albanese, is yet another trained communist, who has his roots in trade unions and the CPA itself, where he has given interviews and been photographed at their events and activities in the past. Linda Burney, handpicked by Anthony Albanese and the current Minister for Indigenous Australians, a very questionable past and also very quick to call any and all opposition to the Voice a hateful racist, which as it stands is now more than half of the country. I could go on and on and on about the communist puppets behind this bill, but for the sake of time, I have to move on. One thing that should be made known to the Australian public is that this Voice to Parliament is nothing new. Neither is the call for a treaty or Aboriginal sovereignty and land rights. All of this originated back in the 1920s by the CPA and other radical revolutionaries who saw Aboriginal advocacy, immigration, and workers' rights as pillars that could be used to eventually overthrow countries with Indigenous populations, like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Following the success the Bolsheviks had with their 1917 revolution in Russia, many documents were being written by communist and Marxist leaders, utilizing the issue of native land rights as a way of fomenting militant revolution in these countries. Ever since then, communists have been behind the creation of most of the Aboriginal committees we see today. Bruce C. Ruxton was a highly decorated World War II veteran, former president of the Victorian RSL, and an all-round Australian hero who has long since been forgotten by the general public. During his life as a public figure, he started to express political concerns about the direction Australia was headed in. In the preface of MacDonald's book, Red Over Black, he claims the following, quote, Australia's future as a free Western nation was seriously threatened by two movements. One, to use the Aboriginal land rights issue to eventually establish a separate Aboriginal nation under communist domination, and second, to fragment a homogenous and stable Australia by a breaking down of a traditional immigration policy, and by the deliberate fostering of a multiculturalism which could only end with the balkanisation of Australia, unquote. Bruce Ruxton was no conspiracy theorist. He was a military insider who loved his country. In fact, he was merited with many honours in his life. Bruce claimed that there was a growing communist influence in Australia, showing how the old-time concept of communist revolutionaries using force to seize control of the state and its institutions during a crisis had been supplanted by a movement of insidious infiltration, which has penetrated deep into the media, the education system, the government bureaucracy, and the most disturbing of all, into many Christian churches. A former Australian communist insider turned whistleblower, Jeff McDonald, in his own words, learned about communist strategy and tactics through a lifetime in the labour and trade union movement and intensified by the years he spent inside the Communist Party. Jeff wrote a series of books and gave a series of lectures warning the Australian public to the extent that Australia was becoming infiltrated by communism.
We were taught about the theory of the national and the colonial question. It had been developed by Joseph Stalin under the instructions of Lenin. Now, put simply, that theory was that the best way to achieve power in any country that had indigenous peoples, such as in Australia with our Aborigines, was to start what you would call an anti-colonial movement for the indigenous peoples to regain their land. Linked with that were issues of promoting so-called multiculturalism and multiracialism, which would break the homogeneity of the nation, which then allowed the communists to take power. Now, with regard to the Aborigines, I never, as I said, took this very seriously. And it wasn't until several years after I was expelled from the party, that was in 1960, that I started to read in the newspapers about the developing land rights movement, claims being made by Aborigines, sympathetic newspaper editorials, and so on. And I started to think to myself, good heavens, this is the theory that we were taught about in the Communist Party. And of course another nudge to make a person with my background wake up to what was happening is that some of the people you would see speaking allegedly on behalf of the Aborigines on the television would be people that you'd grown up with in the Communist Party.
Jeff McDonald details how fake Aboriginal organisations, financed with money through foreign embassies and agents, were set up by communists for the purpose of using issues like land rights to gain legal authority over territory and institutions, which would ultimately allow communists in through the back door. Through the balkanisation of Australia and media propaganda being used as psychological warfare against the Australian public, it would become possible to weaken Australia militarily and put its resources, territory and tax dollars into the hands of communists and nations like China through its proxy Aboriginal rights. One example of this, found in his book Red Over Black, was the World Council of Indigenous Affairs, which often spoke at the United Nations. Quote, the Canberra 1981 conference was its third General Assembly, at which it agreed in principle to develop an international law on Indigenous rights. It calls for the rights of Indigenous people to associate their territory and institutions with one or more states in a manner involving free association, regional autonomy, home rule, or associate statehood as self-governing units. It was highly significant that the World Council of Indigenous Peoples Conference should be held in Australia at a time when the Aboriginal land rights campaign was being greatly intensified. The conference provided support for the campaign launch in April 1979, when the Second National Conference of the National Aboriginal Conference passed a resolution demanding a treaty between Aboriginals and the Commonwealth Government. Immediately following this, as if awaiting a signal, the Aboriginal Treaty Committee emerged, chaired by DHC Coombs, and proclaimed intention of mobilising public opinion amongst whites. Not one single member of Coombs' committee is an Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander. Unquote. Next time you see Antifa and communist-led Aboriginal organisations marching through the streets of Brisbane, Canberra and Melbourne protesting for a treaty or the lawful transfer of land and resources, know that at its core it was always a communist tactic and not an Aboriginal one. In fact, another tactic Jeff McDonald discusses in his book, Red Over Black, is how bought and paid for politicians, members of the press and activists are highly trained Marxists, and regardless of whether they are Aboriginal or not, they don't actually care about Aboriginals or their rights as human beings. They are working for the political expediency of a communist takeover of Australia. They intend to do this by weakening industrial development, promoting destructive levels of immigration, gaining a stronghold in education, and ultimately the transfer of our nation into the hands of radical activists.
Since then, because of the number of questions I've received, and I quite understand that people would wonder and be incredulous about how clever and how highly involved the communist movement is in our society, and how it has been directing this land rights movement. So that I have produced another book, a smaller book called The Evidence. I've gone through the communist archives that are in the Mitchell Library in Sydney and in other libraries, in which they have got all of the newspapers, journals, textbooks and other theoretical material from the communist movement since 1920. And I've shown in this little book how the communists themselves, in order to explain to their own members what they had to do, explained how the ultimate objective is the establishment of a new, separate, independent nation of Aborigines, and they say it in those very words, that so-called Aboriginal nation is to be recognised by countries outside Australia, that they are to have their own army. Now, we all appreciate the fact that the Aborigines neither have the numerical strength, supposing they even wanted this sort of thing, to establish an army. But the idea of an army on land rights areas is to bring in uninvited Asian and other so-called refugees or migrants. Again, that is very well documented from their own sources. Now, as I said, we are discussing a question of Australia's defence and its security, the importance of which cannot be underestimated and concerns the interests of every Australian, their children and the children in the future. It also concerns the welfare of the Aborigines who are being manipulated by these white communist activists.
Jeff McDonald also further explains some of the psychological warfare tactics communists use to further their own agenda. You'll often see these communist tactics being used by the corporate left-wing media, terms attributed to anyone in opposition to the communist plan of taking over Australia. Terms like racist, colonialist, etc. These words are weaponized in order to discredit political opponents on the basis of some subjective moral principle. Like, for an example, "Oh, you don't believe the Aboriginals have a right to self-determination? You must be a racist." Or, "Anyone who celebrates Australia Day must be a colonialist who supports the genocide of Aboriginals." The tactic employed here is to disarm your opinions by discrediting you as some type of unreasonable bigot, when in actuality, the communists don't care about Aboriginals. In fact, when communism does take place, these are usually the very first people to be pushed into the gulags. The point of this exercise of weaponizing words is to further their own political ambitions of Marxism and communism. The people they claim to represent are just political pawns and a means to an end. Nowhere in the world where communism has been implemented has it worked. It's always had devastating results and is directly responsible for the biggest genocides in human history. With enough communists and media personalities using these tactics of psychological warfare, it doesn't take very long before everyday people, who aren't necessarily communists, also start regurgitating these very same words. Like this woman, for an example.
This is ground zero, genocide. Ground zero happened here on 26th of January, 1788. Nobody should be celebrating.
She probably means very well, but does she actually know what she's advocating for? Does she actually know who's behind these causes? Probably not. This is what you call cultural warfare. They can take something that is seen as fringe, wrong, and incorrect, within the space of a generation, make it seem normal, necessary, and pleasant. This type of cultural warfare is often referred to as postmodernism, cultural Marxism, or ideological subversion. This is exactly the slippery slope of ever-changing moral virtues depicted in George Orwell's book, 1984. If you've made it this far, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you share it around with your friends. Thanks for watching. Until next time.